It started with a whisper, in a bar that no longer exists, between two men who never officially met. One offered a name, the other offered silence. And somewhere between the smoke and the scotch, the fate of a nation shifted by a fraction of a breath. That's how it always begins, not with gunshots or explosions, but with a question that no one's supposed to ask. Whose side are you really on? Tonight, we're unsealing a file they swore would stay buried. The story of a defector who never defected, a mission that never officially happened, and a betrayal so complete it rewrote the Cold War. It's a tale stitched together from redacted memos, unmarked graves, and voices recorded through walls too thin to keep secrets. What you're about to hear was never meant to be remembered, and once you've heard it, you may understand why. If you find yourself drawn to the darker corners of history, where truth is negotiable, loyalty is a currency, and the past still listens, you're in the right place. Hit like and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy stories that stare into the fog and don't flinch. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there, because time matters in these stories. Sometimes it's all that does. Now take a breath, dim the lights, settle in. We're going back to a night in 1949. Berlin is divided, wires are humming under the floorboards, and someone's suitcase just clicked open. Not with clothes, but with something colder. Welcome to the part of history that never made the textbooks. The floor was sticky with oil and blood. In the frigid belly of a bombed-out warehouse on the outskirts of Munich, the war was supposed to be over. But it wasn't. Not here. Not yet. A single light bulb swung from the ceiling on a frayed cord, casting flickering shadows on a pile of crates stamped with an eagle, its talons clutching a swastika. It was late April 1945. Outside, artillery echoed like distant thunder. Inside, silence held its breath. 3 men in American uniforms stood before the crates, their faces pale in the dim glow. One of them, a short man with wire-rimmed glasses and an OSS insignia on his shoulder, knelt and pried open a lid. The smell that wafted out was old paper, rubber, and something like scorched electricity. He pulled out a sheaf of documents, thick, technical, stamped Vertraulich, confidential. Another man whistled softly. "What the hell is this?" "Blueprints," the first muttered. "Rockets, guidance systems, chemical propulsion." "Some of these are theoretical," the third added, flipping through a folder. "Anti-gravity, orbital mirrors. Jesus Christ, they were designing space weapons." A new crate, heavier than the rest, creaked open. Inside, a box of index cards and photographs, labeled with cold precision. The names stared back like tombstones. Von Braun, Dornberger, Gerlach, Davis, hundreds more. The OSS man's hands trembled slightly as he read. They weren't just building bombs, they were building futures. One of the officers lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. "So, what's the plan? Arrest them?" The man with the glasses stared at the name Wernher von Braun, printed in thick black type. He exhaled slowly. "We're not taking prisoners," he said. "We're shopping for gods." A long pause, then a dry laugh from the back of the room. "The war isn't over," the OSS man whispered. "It's just changing uniforms." Years earlier, in the sterile silence of a laboratory deep in the heart of Nazi Germany, a boy who had once strapped fireworks to a toy wagon was designing the weapon that would terrify London. Werner Magnus Maximilian von Braun was not a brute. That made him more dangerous. He was something purer, colder, a dreamer unmoored from consequences. He had grown up worshipping Jules Verne and Hermann Oberth, reading about trips to the moon while the rest of Europe rebuilt from the last war. While others memorized geography, he memorized escape velocity. His mind had no borders, his ambition had no brakes. By the time he was 20, he was leading a team of engineers at Kummersdorf, south of Berlin. Their goal was simple, impossible, and sacred: build a machine that could defy gravity and reach the stars. The Reich had other ideas. By 1937, von Braun was working at a top-secret facility on the Baltic coast, Peenemünde, under the watchful eye of the Wehrmacht. There, under heavy guard and funded by the swelling coffers of the Nazi war machine, von Braun's dream turned metallic. He was given everything: staff, labs, and resources. The catch? He had to turn his rocket into a weapon. He did it. The result would become the V-2, the Vergeltungswaffe 2, or Retribution Weapon 2, the first ballistic missile, the first man-made object to enter the edge of space, and the first to rain death silently from above. The contradictions were grotesque and staggering. Von Braun was designing the future while Germany was being dragged into darkness. He wore an SS uniform, not by choice, he claimed later, but by persuasion. He shook hands with Himmler. He smiled politely in photographs with Adolf Hitler. In private, he talked about space stations. In public, he built missiles for a genocidal regime. The V-2 was not tested in the desert. It was built in Dora-Mittelbau, a concentration camp where tens of thousands of prisoners, Jews, political dissidents, and enslaved laborers were worked to death in underground tunnels to manufacture the parts. They died in silence, lungs choked with stone dust, backs broken under metal beams. And above them, far from the tunnels, von Braun walked among his prototypes with a clipboard and a dream. When questioned years later, he said he was only interested in the technology. He did not oversee the labor. He was apolitical. He did what he had to do to keep his dream alive, but records show otherwise. He visited the camp, he made inspections, he made requests. One survivor remembered him distinctly: tall, elegant, well-dressed. He walked through the tunnels with a look of disgust, not at our condition, but at the inefficiency. The war raged, London burned, and each time a V-2 missile landed, silent until it exploded, von Braun's ambition inched closer to the stars, over the corpses of the enslaved. By 1944, the V-2 had become Hitler's last hope for a miracle. But it came too late. The Allies were closing in. Cities lay in ruins. The Reich was collapsing. Inside Peenemünde, panic bloomed. Von Braun, now in his early 30s, had seen the writing on the wall. He knew what was coming: defeat, arrest, and perhaps death. The question now was simple. Which captors would get to him first? The Soviets. They would squeeze him dry and shoot him. The Americans? Perhaps they would see his value. And so, as Berlin burned, von Braun made his move. With a handful of his closest engineers, including Walter Dornberger and Arthur Rudolph, he orchestrated a plan as bold and clinical as one of his flight trajectories. They would escape. They would surrender to the Americans, and they would offer a bargain, not a plea for mercy, a trade. He gathered what he could: blueprints, documents, parts, even pieces of the V-2's guidance systems, and buried them in barrels in a forest near the town of Oberammergau. He ordered other documents burned, others buried deeper still. Then they began their journey through the collapsing Reich. For weeks they traveled by foot, wagon, and stolen vehicle, dodging SS patrols and avoiding Soviet encirclements. Some of their party died, others defected. Von Braun, his arm broken in a car crash during the escape, refused to turn back. They reached the American lines in early May 1945, exhausted, filthy, and carrying the future in their satchels. When an American officer asked for their names, von Braun didn't hesitate. "My name," he said, brushing dust from his uniform, "is Wernher von Braun. I can help you win the next war." And just like that, the line between science and espionage vanished. Behind the scenes, the OSS and Army intelligence were already planning. The documents recovered from the warehouse near Munich, the ones with von Braun's name, had been delivered to the Pentagon. There was a race now, not for land or oil, but for mines. The Soviets were already raiding labs in East Germany, abducting scientists and looting archives. Stalin had given orders: get the German tech before the Americans do. The Americans, desperate to avoid another Pearl Harbor in the form of a Soviet space weapon, responded in kind. The program was codenamed Operation Overcast, and later, more famously, Operation Paperclip. It wasn't about justice. It was about power. The files of known Nazis were quietly rewritten. SS affiliations were downplayed. War crime allegations were ignored. The Holocaust was not denied. It was deemed irrelevant. The focus was clear: bring them in, scrub them clean, and put them to work. Von Braun and his team were relocated to Fort Bliss, Texas, under military supervision. They were told to keep quiet, to sign papers, to become someone else. In one internal memo, a Pentagon official wrote, "Their record is not without blemish. However, their utility outweighs past indiscretions." Meanwhile, back in Germany, the bodies at Dora were buried in mass graves. Few knew their names. Fewer still knew they had helped build the moon rocket. At Fort Bliss, von Braun found himself in a paradox. He was a prisoner and a VIP. He was interrogated, but also protected. He gave lectures, he built test rockets, he smiled for reporters. When asked about his past, he laughed it off. "I was always more interested in space travel than in war." But not everyone believed him. A low-ranking army translator, a Jewish refugee from Berlin, recognized von Braun one day on base. He'd seen him once before, in the tunnels of Dora, walking past the dead. He reported it to a superior. Nothing happened. The higher the stakes, the less anyone wanted to remember. Von Braun's duality deepened. By day, he spoke to American generals about propulsion vectors. By night, he wrote letters in German to colleagues still in Europe, some of whom were under investigation for war crimes. He dreamed of space colonies and orbiting hotels, but in his nightmares, the tunnels came back. So he buried it all. And America let him. After all, he was useful, he was charming, and he had promised them the stars. Suspense builds. In the next part, whispers of Soviet spies, internal government debates, and a growing network of secrecy begin to take shape as Operation Paperclip explodes into its next phase. The train was never supposed to stop. It was a freight line running through the twisted skeleton of a defeated Reich, its cargo hastily sealed in crates marked agricultural equipment, but packed instead with circuit boards, gyroscopes, and folded V2 fins scavenged from laboratories that no longer existed. The U.S. soldiers guarding it were under orders not to open the crates. They were also told not to ask questions. But the silence of the train was louder than any siren. It was mid-May 1945. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich had officially surrendered. But in the quiet corridors of intelligence bunkers and temporary army offices stretching from Frankfurt to Washington, the war had simply slipped out of uniform and into shadows. In the forward car, a man named Karl Leach stood smoking behind a curtain. A former Abwehr analyst turned OSS informant, Leach had spent the last weeks ferrying names, rumors, and blueprints across the no-man's land between retreating Wehrmacht and advancing Allied forces. He spoke 5 languages. He lied in all of them. As the train rumbled south toward Bavaria, Leach clutched a satchel of files destined not for Nuremberg, but for an airbase near Le Havre. Inside was a growing list of names like atomic coals glowing under ash. Scientists, engineers, experts in rocketry, nerve gas, metallurgy, and esoteric fields like sonic weaponry and zero-point energy. They had served the Reich, but they had also created things America didn't understand and couldn't afford to let fall into Soviet hands. In a safe house near Oberjoch, Wernher von Braun sat by a cracked fireplace, scribbling equations into the margins of a Bible. It was a performance, partially. His injured arm was in a sling, but his mind never stopped calculating. Nearby, his brother Magnus cleaned a stolen revolver, eyes darting at every passing truck. Their team had splintered. Some had tried to vanish, others had been captured by the Red Army, but most waited like von Braun, neither prisoners nor fugitives, something in between, possessions that had not yet been tagged. American officers began arriving at Peenemünde days after the surrender, expecting scorched earth. What they found instead was revelation. The facility had been partially destroyed, yes, sabotaged by retreating German staff, but what remained was enough to induce awe and unease in equal measure. Bunkers lined with miles of test reports, wind tunnels larger than aircraft hangars, a launch pad still slick with hydraulic oil, and documents, hundreds of thousands of pages of data, designs, fuel combinations, guidance logic. It was the sum total of 2 decades of rocket science, buried in filing cabinets beneath the sand. Lieutenant Colonel Holger Toftoy, an Army Ordnance officer with an instinct for strategic gold, sent an urgent cable. "We must secure this technology immediately." And the minds behind it. But this wasn't a clean extraction. The American government was still publicly committed to prosecuting Nazi war criminals. The Geneva Conventions had just been cited at Nuremberg. And yet, in the same breath, behind steel doors, generals debated how to quietly import men who had pledged allegiance to the SS. Names were crossed off wanted lists with a stroke of a pen. Files were altered. Some of the worst crimes were simply omitted. An entire division of bureaucrats was assembled not to investigate war criminals, but to sanitize them. It started with a name: Operation Overcast, a term so deliberately bland that even Army secretaries didn't flinch when typing it. At first, it was pitched as a short-term scientific consultation program. Just a few weeks, a dozen minds, temporary help. But the truth was never so temporary. The men targeted under Overcast were not obscure technicians. They were senior architects of Nazi weapons programs, many of them with known affiliations to the SS or the Nazi Party. Arthur Rudolph, the operations director of the Mittelwerk plant, had overseen thousands of deaths under slave labor. Yet his file was trimmed down to highlight logistical achievements under difficult conditions. Hubertus Strughold, later called the father of space medicine, had been present at medical experiments on concentration camp inmates, but his file praised his aerospace innovation. Von Braun's own file was marked SS Sturmbannführer, equivalent to major, but within weeks that line was quietly blacked out. In the field, agents were already executing retrieval operations. Teams were deployed into collapsing German towns to locate high-value scientists and bring them in, often ahead of advancing Soviet troops. In some cases, family members were used as leverage. In others, promises of immunity, or veiled threats, did the job. Tensions with the Soviets escalated rapidly. At a checkpoint near Bleicherode, Soviet officers demanded access to a building where several key scientists had taken shelter. American guards stalled. Papers were forged. A night later, the scientists were gone, driven south under military escort. The files were starting to grow teeth. In Bavaria, an incident almost ended the operation before it began. Von Braun's team had been housed in a remote village under the supervision of Army counterintelligence. Late one night, a black Mercedes approached, without headlights. Inside were men with flawless German but unfamiliar boots. Their papers, when presented, were Soviet military intelligence. The local American officer, suspicious, stalled them at gunpoint. Later, a signal intercept revealed that Soviet operatives had orders to abduct von Braun and relocate him to Kaliningrad under cover of chaos. Within 48 hours, the U.S. launched an emergency extraction. Von Braun and his core group, including Dornberger and Debus, were flown out of Bavaria aboard a military aircraft labeled as a Red Cross supply plane. Official records stated they were POWs en route to questioning. In reality, they were already being processed for integration into U.S. military programs. The scale of Overcast quickly outgrew its name. By the end of 1945, it was rebranded Operation Paperclip, named for the small metal fasteners used to attach falsified, clean biographies to dirty personnel files. The name itself was a bureaucratic joke, but its implications would reshape global history. At Fort Strong in Boston Harbor, a young intelligence officer named Evelyn Wexler reviewed the growing dossier. She had joined the Army out of patriotism and idealism, a Polish-American Jew whose family had lost relatives in the camps. What she found in the files turned her stomach. She raised objections to von Braun's inclusion, citing evidence of his direct visits to Dora and his SS service. Her report was shelved. She was reassigned. The moral rot didn't smell like rot. It was clean. It was filed alphabetically. Inside the Pentagon, the debate raged, not over whether these men had served evil, but whether their brilliance outweighed the cost of bringing them in. One memo phrased it bluntly: "We are not recruiting individuals, we are acquiring capabilities." But not everyone was comfortable. A young assistant in the State Department, Charles Marsh, wrote to his superior, "We are burning the page before we turn it. Someday these names will be known. What will we say then?" His letter went unanswered. Meanwhile, Soviet agents had begun combing the wreckage of Peenemunde's eastern laboratories. The USSR's own program, led by Sergei Korolev, was desperate for an edge. In one notable incident, Soviet teams discovered a stash of fuel mixture formulas hidden inside a church crypt. But most of the truly valuable documents had already been removed by American teams. And the Americans had something even more precious. They had the mines. At Fort Bliss, von Braun's team worked in confinement, not prisoners, but certainly not free. They were forbidden from leaving base without permission. Their mail was monitored, conversations in German were recorded. But in the lab, they were kings again. Testing resumed on V2 derivatives. New propulsion theories were sketched. And always, von Braun smiled. Charming, brilliant, calculated. He held seminars. He taught American engineers how the guidance systems worked, how to shape fuel combustion patterns. He answered every question except one: how many died to make this knowledge possible? In quiet corners of Washington, whispers grew. The Justice Department had begun noticing oddities, gaps in immigration records, blank files where criminal affiliations should have been noted. But the Pentagon held the shield. Every inquiry was deflected as a matter of national security. Even the president was kept partially insulated. Truman, though initially opposed to recruiting former Nazis, was advised that these men were essential to preventing Soviet technological dominance. By 1946, over 100 scientists had been brought to the United States under the Paperclip program. Many more were on their way. The public was told nothing. At a military airstrip, a plane touched down under a redacted manifest. Inside were men who had once dined with Himmler. They stepped into the American sun like actors in a play where the ending had already been decided. No charges, no trials, just jobs. And for every man who arrived, another file was sealed. A quiet truth was taking root, known only to a few. America was no longer merely fighting evil. It was bargaining with it. The Cold War hadn't begun yet, but its first lie was already written in ink. And in a small office at Fort Bliss, Wernher von Braun stood at a blackboard drawing an arc, not of a missile, but of a dream, a path to the stars traced through the ruins of a nightmare. Behind him, a soldier flipped through a stack of personnel files. On the last page was a list of names. A handwritten note circled 2 of them. Already on Nazi watch lists, now flagged as valuable assets. The line between guilt and utility had blurred, and no one seemed willing to redraw it. The story continues. In the next part, the whitewashing of Nazi records accelerates, media manipulation begins, and the seeds of NASA are planted. All while the ghosts of Dora and the silence of the dead cling to the shadows of rocket trails. The first time she saw his name, her coffee cup slipped from her hand and shattered against the linoleum floor. It was 1947. The war had been over for 2 years, and in the fluorescent hum of an Army research lab in White Sands, New Mexico, the past was supposed to be buried. But there it was, typed neatly on a personnel roster, sandwiched between an electronics expert and a ballistics engineer, Wernher Magnus von Braun. Next to it, in clean ink, the label read, Special Technical Advisor, U.S. Department of Ordnance. The woman who dropped the cup was named Ruth Lieber. She was 26, Jewish, and had fled Berlin in 1939 with her parents, both physicists. She had grown up on her father's stories of relativity and exile, his whispered grief over cousins who hadn't made it out. She remembered the nights in London during the Blitz, the searchlights, the sirens, the way windows rattled long before the V2's impact. She had always imagined the architects of those missiles as faceless monsters. But now she was being asked to collaborate with one, and the monsters had been given desks, titles, salaries, and perhaps, most chillingly, new names. No one spoke openly of it, but the silence was everywhere. Ruth's supervisor, when pressed, offered only a stiff shrug. "He's here to help. That's all you need to know." By the time she returned to her station, the fragments of the broken cup had been swept away. But the crack in her faith, in her country, in justice, in memory, had only begun to deepen. Behind closed doors in Washington, the deception had long since hardened into policy. President Harry Truman had signed a directive in 1945 explicitly forbidding the recruitment of individuals known to have engaged in Nazi political activities or war crimes. It had been a symbolic gesture, a line drawn in the dust to signal America's moral posture in the aftermath of Nuremberg. But even before the ink dried, a different set of pens was already scribbling over the margins. At the War Department, a special unit under the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency began assembling what they called cover files. These were not forgeries in the traditional sense. The facts they contained were technically accurate. They simply omitted the rest. A scientist's SS membership? Omitted. His visits to Dora-Mittelbau? Omitted. Any charges, suspicions, or affiliations that could threaten his eligibility? Either erased or reinterpreted. Political pressure became compulsory service. Collaboration became non-ideological participation. The documents were sanitized, stapled, and submitted under the glowing header of strategic value. In the space of a signature, war criminals became experts, and experts became American property. The process was refined and ritualized. Each candidate underwent a vetting known as the Denazification Clearance Review, a process riddled with loopholes. Affidavits were signed by colleagues, often other paperclip recruits. Negative testimony was dismissed unless corroborated by at least 2 independent sources, an impossible standard in post-war chaos. And even when irrefutable evidence surfaced, it was buried. One of the first to benefit from this machinery was Hubertus Strughold, a physician who had overseen experiments in hypothermia and altitude exposure on camp inmates. His file had been thick with references to human experimentation. But by the time he arrived in Texas, those references were gone. He was described instead as an authority in aviation medicine with a distinguished academic record. When asked, an Army official remarked that Strughold's past was not in scope. His future was what mattered. The same was said for Walter Schreiber, a medical officer linked to typhus vaccine tests on prisoners. He had been flagged for war crimes by the Soviets, but was quickly shuttled to the U.S. under the pretense of providing expertise in biological warfare. Internal memos advised ignoring the Soviet claims as propaganda. At the center of this web, Wernher von Braun played his role with a kind of disarming grace. He attended briefings with an almost boyish enthusiasm, joked with Army personnel about lunar habitats, and maintained a careful ambiguity whenever the past was mentioned. When pressed about his SS rank, he deflected. It was symbolic, I assure you, a technicality. When questioned about Dora, he replied, "I was an engineer, not a prison guard." He never raised his voice. He never denied the facts. He simply made them feel irrelevant. And for many, that was enough. The press had begun to take notice. Small articles appeared in regional papers, mentions of German scientists aiding American rocketry efforts. There was discomfort, but no outrage. Most Americans were too focused on inflation, housing shortages, and the looming menace of the Soviet Union. The word Nazi still stung, but communist was the new threat. It was this pivot from justice to pragmatism that allowed paperclip to flourish. By 1948, over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians had been relocated to the United States under various classified programs. They were dispersed across military bases, university laboratories, and aerospace companies. Some were given new identities, others retained their names, but were shielded from scrutiny by layers of red tape. In the desert sands of New Mexico and the green fields of Alabama, the seeds of America's space program were being watered with moral compromise. At Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, von Braun's team began assembling what would become the core of NASA's propulsion division. They worked on rocket design, missile stabilization, and high-altitude guidance. Some of the designs were directly adapted from V2 schematics. Others were new, born in American labs, but conceived in German notebooks. To the public, it was innovation. To those who knew better, it was inheritance. Among the few to voice concern was Eleanor Meyer, a defense analyst at the Rand Corporation. She had reviewed several paperclip files and raised alarms about inconsistencies. In one memo, she wrote, "We have traded truth for talent. When the reckoning comes, we will have no defense." Her memo was marked sensitive and quietly archived. Still, whispers persisted. A German émigré named Jacob Klein, working as a linguist for Army intelligence, stumbled upon a list of paperclip arrivals and recognized 3 names, men he had seen in Berlin interrogating Jewish mathematicians in 1942. He reported it. His superior thanked him for his diligence. A week later, Klein was reassigned to a signals unit in Alaska. In Fort Bliss, von Braun continued to ascend. He was no longer simply tolerated, he was admired. Young engineers sought his advice. Military brass praised his clarity. Reporters, when they did visit, found him articulate, humble, and always ready with a quote about humanity's destiny in space. When one journalist asked if he regretted his wartime service, von Braun smiled faintly and replied, "Regret is a poor engine for progress." The phrase would be repeated in profiles, stripped of context, made inspirational. But not everyone forgot. In a modest apartment in Brooklyn, Ruth Lieber reread the personnel list each night, searching for more ghosts. She wrote letters to advocacy groups, Holocaust remembrance councils, and even congressmen. Few responded. Those who did offered platitudes. The world, they said, had changed. But she knew it hadn't. It had simply turned. One day, walking past a bookstore, she saw a magazine with von Braun's face on the cover. The headline read, "The Man Who Will Take Us to the Moon." She stared at it for a long time. Later, she clipped it out, folded it neatly, and placed it in a box beside her father's last letter from Berlin, a letter that had ended with the words, "If we don't survive, make sure they remember who built the rockets." The box remained sealed, but the story was just beginning. He was reading a Walt Whitman poem when the phone rang. Not aloud, just silently, beneath the breath, lips barely moving. His fingers hovered over the page, tracing each line as if by doing so, he could force the words to settle deeper into his bones. It was Leaves of Grass, the section called Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. He loved that one. "What is it then between us?" the poem asked. "What is the count of the scores or hundreds of years between us?" It was, perhaps, a strange thing for a man like Wernher von Braun to be reading in a dusty military dormitory in Fort Bliss, Texas. But he had started it weeks ago and kept returning to it, almost religiously, as if Whitman might offer some kind of cleansing. The page still fluttered slightly in his lap when the voice on the other end said simply, "Dr. von Braun, the Associated Press is requesting an interview. They'd like to talk about the V2 and America's future in space." He didn't flinch. He nodded, even though no one could see him. "Yes," he said. "Of course." It was the spring of 1947. The desert air outside was dry and brutal. And in the strange limbo of Fort Bliss, von Braun had become something like a ghost made flesh. He walked the base with the gait of someone who had shed a former life, but whose shadow hadn't quite caught up. Soldiers saluted him with curiosity rather than protocol. Scientists listened with both awe and unease. Some days he was addressed as Herr Doctor, other days just Werner. But nobody dared ask him what it meant. To have built the rockets that nearly won a war for evil, and now to build new ones for a country that had narrowly survived it. Officially, he was there as part of a U.S. Army Ordnance program. Unofficially, he was being groomed, not just for scientific leadership, but for myth. The Americans didn't want a Nazi. They wanted a genius, a visionary, a man who could make the future bigger than the past. And so they began to construct him from the pieces they liked best. He was told to downplay his accent during public appearances. Speak more slowly, smile often, stay away from political commentary. In private meetings, he was instructed on how to frame his past. Say you were apolitical, one Army handler advised. Emphasize the coercion. Everyone understands coercion. When von Braun objected, softly, politely, that he had signed his SS documents voluntarily, the reply was swift and without emotion. Then don't mention it. The first time he sat down for a public interview in America, it was with a young reporter from the El Paso Herald-Post. She was earnest and friendly, the kind who smiled with her entire face. She asked about rocket propulsion, high-altitude testing, and how soon America might send a satellite into orbit. Von Braun answered eagerly, almost passionately, falling back into the comfort of equations and hypotheticals. But then she asked gently, "Do you ever think about the war?" There was a pause, long enough that the room seemed to tip slightly sideways. He looked at his hands, folded so tightly the knuckles had gone white. Then he smiled again. But it wasn't real. "I was only ever interested in the stars," he said. Later, the recording would reveal a small tremor in his voice during that line, a crack, subtle and sharp, not quite grief, not quite guilt, but something. That something began to surface more often. In letters to colleagues back in Germany, he spoke of isolation and a growing weariness. "I walk under a sun that burns through me," he wrote to a former assistant. "Here I am free, and yet I have never felt more like a prisoner." He wrote about America in strange terms, a land of open skies and closed hearts, a place that saw him not for what he was, but for what it needed him to become. "They do not care who I was," he wrote, "only what I can build." But the past did not stay buried. Not really. In 1948, a Soviet defector known only by the code name Kasparov handed British intelligence a cache of stolen documents. Among them, a complete personnel file from the SS archives. Inside was the original application von Braun had signed to join the SS in 1937, complete with personal notes from Heinrich Himmler. "An enthusiastic and loyal man," the margin read, "valuable to the future of our Reich." The leak triggered panic in Washington. The British wanted to confront the Americans with the evidence, but the CIA intervened immediately. "Highly sensitive," they said, "national security implications." The documents were returned without comment. Inside the FBI, a different kind of storm was brewing. Senior agents were briefed on the leak and shown the SS files. Some were horrified, others argued for context. "So he joined the SS," one said. "If he hadn't, he'd be dead and we'd have no rockets." But a small group of counterintelligence officers began pushing for an internal investigation. One of them, a Jewish agent named Saul Margolis, refused to back down. "We're burying evidence," he told his supervisor. "We're not just ignoring history, we're rewriting it." Margolis's memo was marked classified and buried. 2 weeks later, he was reassigned to a desk job in New Orleans. Meanwhile, von Braun's American image continued to crystallize. Popular Science ran a feature titled Rocket Man of Tomorrow. Collier's devoted a full issue to speculative art of lunar bases, featuring von Braun as chief designer. Life magazine ran a photo spread showing him hiking in the Sierra Nevadas, smiling at the summit, wind in his hair. The caption read, "From Hitler's Germany to the American Dream." But for von Braun, the dream was never quite seamless. He remained restless. He still read Whitman at night. He smoked more. He talked less. Once, during a tour of the Smithsonian Air and Space exhibit, he stood in front of a dismantled V-2 warhead and stared at it for nearly 15 minutes, silent. A colleague approached and asked if he was all right. Von Braun nodded. "Yes," he whispered. "It's just strange to see one's sins displayed behind glass." There were moments when his handlers began to worry. At a press dinner in Washington, after too much wine, he made a joke about having once designed a rocket to destroy London. The room went quiet. Then someone laughed. The tension broke. But later, in a private report, an aide wrote, He's slipping. The past is seeping through. To manage the threat, a campaign of containment was launched. Von Braun's public appearances were closely scripted. Interview requests were filtered through a special Pentagon committee. Any media questions about his SS membership were deemed off-limits. One internal memo even advised canceling an event because the subject has shown signs of psychological instability when discussing World War II. Still, the cracks widened. One day, while visiting a university research center in Pasadena, von Braun was approached by a young German-American student. The student asked, "Did you ever meet Himmler?" Von Braun froze. He smiled stiffly and replied, "He was not the kind of man one forgets." The student nodded, then added, "My grandfather died in Buchenwald." Von Braun said nothing. He returned to Fort Bliss that evening and canceled the next day's meetings. Instead, he sat in his room and wrote a letter. It began, "I do not know if I will ever be forgiven, but I hope one day I will forgive myself." He never sent it. Back in Washington, the Soviet defectors file had reached the Senate Subcommittee on Internal Security. A small group of lawmakers began pressing for disclosure. "We have a right to know who we've brought into our house," one senator declared. But the Department of Defense pushed back hard. They cited national security, Cold War urgency, and the essential nature of Dr. von Braun's work. Files were withheld, testimonies were classified, the committee was stonewalled, and the truth stayed hidden. But not for everyone. At a Jewish cultural center in Brooklyn, Ruth Lieber read a whispered report in a foreign language newsletter. SS files leaked to British by Soviet agent. Names include German scientists now working in America. She didn't need to read further. She knew. That night, she returned to the box beneath her bed, the one with her father's letter and the magazine clipping. She added the newsletter and sealed the lid. Outside, in the streets of Brooklyn, life moved on. Baseball games, summer heat, the smell of roasted peanuts and sidewalk dust. But in Fort Bliss, the man who had once built rockets for Hitler now stared into the desert and dreamed of Mars. His voice, once bold, now quieter, still spoke of humanity's destiny among the stars. But even as he spoke, he carried with him the unbearable gravity of Earth, the weight of silence, the burden of reinvention. Because somewhere beneath the uniforms and applause, beneath the headlines and the promises, Wernher von Braun was still what he had always been, a man who built weapons for monsters and then helped rewrite the ending. And as the sky darkened and the Cold War deepened, one question hovered above everything like a missile suspended mid-flight. If truth was the cost of progress, how long before the bill came due? They met in silence. It was October 5th, 1957, just before dawn, behind a sealed conference room door at the Pentagon. No coffee, no jokes, no one even removed their coats. The brass had been called in the moment the signal was confirmed. At exactly 9:36 p.m. the night before, the Soviets had fired something into the sky, and it hadn't come back down. A sphere, 23 inches wide, blinking and beeping as it raced around the Earth. Sputnik, the first artificial satellite in human history. And it hadn't been American. In that sterile, dimly lit room in Washington, the gravity of that truth pressed against every man's chest like a lead vest. One general broke the tension by stating the obvious. "The Russians beat us, and they used a Nazi to do it." The silence afterward was longer than the statement itself. Then another voice, lower, slower, with a southern drawl and a kind of bitterness baked into it, said, "Well, we've got a Nazi too. Maybe it's time we let him off the leash." And that was how Wernher von Braun, the former SS officer whose V-2s once terrorized London, was finally handed the keys to America's future. He was in Huntsville, Alabama, when he got the call. The Army had stationed him there after Fort Bliss, giving him a little more freedom, a little more autonomy, and a lot more responsibility. He had been building rockets again. Not weapons, not officially, but launch vehicles. The kind that could one day carry satellites, or even men, into orbit. But his work had been smothered for years by bureaucracy, rivalries, and a deep-seated unease that still lingered in certain American circles. The ghosts of Mittelwerk and Dora clung to his name like smoke. Even now, after a decade on U.S. soil, there were Pentagon insiders who referred to him only as the German. But all that changed with a single beep from space. The next few weeks were a blur of briefings, approvals, and long-awaited permissions. The White House was in a state of controlled panic. Eisenhower, a man not easily shaken, demanded a response that would be decisive, dazzling, and American. And in the confusion of national insecurity, the deal was sealed. Von Braun would finally be allowed to launch, not just a rocket, a dream. Explorer 1 lifted off on January 31st, 1958. At Cape Canaveral, as the Redstone-based Jupiter C missile cracked the sky open, von Braun stood in the control center and watched with hands clasped behind his back, saying nothing. When the satellite reached orbit and the data confirmed success, his face remained unreadable. He simply nodded. A quiet, almost reverent gesture, not of triumph, but of inevitability. Later, when the press asked how he felt, he replied, "I have waited many years for this moment. It feels correct." In the weeks that followed, Wernher von Braun became something he had never quite managed to be before. A household name. He was invited onto television programs, featured in glossy magazine spreads, interviewed by major newspapers that had once refused to even print his name. The Saturday Evening Post called him the architect of America's space future. Time magazine dubbed him the Rocket Man. Children sent him fan letters. College students quoted his speeches. Suburban parents named their dogs Wernher. And somewhere in all that noise, the past began to fade, not erased, but blurred, quietly, strategically. The launch of Explorer 1 didn't just ignite a space race, it ignited a reinvention. A myth-making machine roared to life, and von Braun was at its center. His memoirs were ghost-written and meticulously sanitized. His early years in Peenemünde were reframed as purely scientific, devoid of political allegiance. His SS rank was downplayed, recontextualized, reworded into a bureaucratic accident. He was described not as a Nazi, but as a reluctant participant in a regime he neither supported nor understood. On television, he spoke with practiced charm, quoting Shakespeare, referencing American poets, and always avoiding the word camp. But others didn't forget, and they didn't forgive. Behind the scenes, tensions grew. At NASA, which had just been officially formed to centralize America's space program, many American-born engineers chafed at von Braun's sudden elevation. Men who had worked in Pasadena or Cleveland or Cambridge, who had studied under Goddard or designed fuel systems in anonymity, now found themselves reporting to the smiling, telegenic former enemy. Some referred to him derisively as the Führer of flight. One engineer, in a private memo, called him the world's most successful war criminal. These whispers, of course, never reached the evening news. And yet, even within von Braun's inner circle, the discomfort lingered. Some of his colleagues, men who had come with him from Germany under Operation Paperclip, had begun to speak differently in private. One, Ludwig Roth, once remarked over whiskey, "We have built castles in the sky, but they are foundations made of ash." Another, silently reviewing old design sketches for the V2, whispered, "These lines, they are drawn in blood." And then, one autumn evening in 1960, the past tore through the present. The Frankfurter Rundschau, a left-leaning West German newspaper, published a series of leaked documents that had never been meant to surface. Copies of internal SS communications, eyewitness reports from Dora survivors, and one particularly damning memorandum signed by von Braun himself, authorizing additional disciplinary procedures for workers caught delaying production. The implication was horrifying. Von Braun had not merely known about the death camp laborers who built his rockets. He had managed them. The American press hesitated. Some outlets picked it up, others buried it. But in Europe, the story exploded. Protests erupted outside U.S. consulates. Holocaust survivors wrote open letters demanding justice. A former French resistance fighter called von Braun the smiling executioner of Nordhausen. In Washington, panic returned. A classified meeting was convened at Langley. The president's science advisor asked the question everyone feared: do we protect a legacy or expose a liability? The answer, once again, came down to orbit. Inside the Pentagon, a line was drawn. "Don't ask about the camps," one advisor said bluntly. "Ask about the orbit." The narrative was adjusted. Von Braun issued a carefully worded statement. "I deeply regret any suffering caused during the war. My focus has always been scientific, not political." When asked in a televised interview whether he had ever visited the slave labor tunnels of Mittelwerk, he paused, then said, "If I had known the extent, I would have done something." He was lying. He had visited the tunnels repeatedly, but by now the lie was smoother than the truth. The American public, bombarded with images of lunar models and orbital trajectories, mostly looked the other way. The idea of space had become intoxicating. It was progress. It was hope. It was American. And Wernher von Braun was its prophet. In 1962, standing beside President Kennedy, von Braun unveiled the preliminary plans for the Saturn V, the vehicle that would take men to the moon. Applause rang out. Camera shutters clicked. No one mentioned the 20,000 dead laborers who had once died building his first dreams beneath a mountain of rock and concrete. And yet, late at night, von Braun would sometimes sit alone in his study, watching old newsreels on mute. Footage of V2s launching, survivors of Dora speaking in trembling voices, the wreckage of London. He watched with the stillness of a man observing someone else's life, detached, not indifferent, just distant, as if he himself were a satellite, orbiting the truth but never touching it. In an unpublished diary entry from that year, he wrote, "The stars are silent. They do not ask how we got here, only that we keep moving forward." And so he did. He was standing in the sun when the question cut through the applause like a knife. June 15, 1965, a press event in Houston. The Saturn V prototype was on proud display, a gleaming steel testament to American ambition. Journalists gathered in tight rows, sweat bleeding through collars, notebooks flipping in cadence with NASA's projected timeline. There were questions about launch windows, escape velocities, engine redundancies, all routine, all expected. Then came a woman's voice from the back, clear, unwavering. "Dr. von Braun, do you remember Dora?" For a moment, everything stopped. Even the breeze seemed to pause. Von Braun's hands, folded neatly at his waist, twitched slightly. He turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing not in anger, but in calculation. The reporter repeated herself. "Do you remember Dora, the camp, the people who died building your rockets?" His mouth parted, then closed. He blinked once, then with the calm of a man trained to deflect, he said, "I was not responsible for those operations. My role was always technical." But the words came slower this time, waited. The crowd shifted. Cameras whirred. One lens caught something unusual, a flicker in his expression, a wetness at the corner of his eye. Whether it was a tear or merely sweat, no one could say. He didn't wipe it away. He simply turned back toward the Saturn V and walked off the stage, leaving the reporters murmuring behind him. That moment never aired on television. In fact, most Americans never heard the question at all. The clip was edited, trimmed, filed under miscellaneous footage, and quietly shelved. And just like that, the myth moved forward, uninterrupted. But outside the polished walls of NASA and the carefully curated broadcasts, the atmosphere had begun to shift. The 1960s were unraveling. Civil rights marches thundered through the streets of Birmingham and Selma. Black students sat in at lunch counters while sheriffs swung batons. Across the country, young men were shipped to Vietnam, and their brothers returned in coffins. Protesters chanted in the streets, "Hell no, we won't go," burning draft cards, burning flags, burning illusions. In the midst of this national reckoning, over race, over war, over the soul of America, people began to ask different questions. Not just what are we building, but who is building it and why. And the name Wernher von Braun, once paraded as a scientific savior, now landed with a different kind of echo in certain circles, especially in the offices of Washington and the shadows of Langley. In March of 1966, a freshman congressman from New York introduced a bill to investigate the origins of Operation Paperclip. His name was Jerome Kaplan, the son of Polish immigrants and the nephew of a man who had vanished near Dora-Mittelbau in 1944. Kaplan held up photocopied documents on the House floor: flight manifests, decrypted telegrams, declassified Nazi correspondence. He named names, not just von Braun's, but others too. Men who had been quietly naturalized, promoted, celebrated. Men whose fingerprints were on both blueprints and body bags. The reaction was swift, not from the public. Most Americans never heard Kaplan's speech. But inside intelligence circles, phones lit up. Old arrangements were reactivated. The FBI contacted NASA's legal department. "Just keep an eye out," they said. The CIA dispatched quiet men to review old files and, more importantly, ensure certain ones remained closed. Kaplan's bill died in committee. No hearings were held, no subpoenas issued, but the whispers grew louder. That same year, a Holocaust survivor named Miriam Feldstein stood outside the gates of Cape Kennedy with a hand-painted sign that read, "My father died in Dora. His killer works inside." She was interviewed by a local radio station. The tape never aired. When she asked why, the producer told her, flatly, "No one wants to hear that while we're going to the moon." Even as von Braun's fame continued to climb, the cracks beneath the surface widened. Not publicly, not yet, but behind closed doors, where dissent couldn't be edited out. In a secure facility in Virginia, a former OSS operative named David Winslow filed a report. In it, he detailed a recovered audio tape sourced from a captured German officer, labeled simply Peenemünde 1944. The recording, muffled and degraded, featured a man berating another in thick German. The voice was aggressive, commanding, furious. The context became clear after the 6th minute. The superior officer, believed to be von Braun, was shouting at a slave laborer for sabotaging a fuel component. The prisoner begs for water. The voice replies, "Water is for workers. You are a mouth with no use." Winslow's report was never acknowledged. 3 weeks later, the tape was gone from the archives. Back at NASA, von Braun pressed forward. He oversaw simulations, tested payload modules, revised escape staging. He gave more interviews, carefully screened, and wrote a book titled The Next 50 Years in Space. It sold well. He was praised for his optimism, his vision, his faith in the stars. But in private moments, when the cameras were gone, those closest to him noticed something shift. During a late-night meeting in 1967, a junior engineer made a joke about getting away with murder. Von Braun didn't laugh. He didn't even look up. He simply whispered, "I never killed anyone. I built the rocket." That year, protesters returned, not to NASA this time, but to Congress. Survivors of Buchenwald, now elderly and frail, carried documents, photos, testimonies. They delivered them to Senate offices, to press rooms, to any intern who would listen. One envelope reached a staffer at the New York Times. It contained a list of known Dora deaths attributed to sabotage punishment. The staffer passed it to his editor. The editor read it, nodded, and said, "We'll revisit it after the launch." The launch, of course, meant Apollo 11, and nothing was going to derail it. By the summer of 1968, the nation was unraveling. Martin Luther King Jr. was dead. Bobby Kennedy was dead. Chicago was on fire. Nixon was rising. But amidst all that chaos, NASA's countdown was sacred. It was the one thing that still made Americans feel like the future could be bright. And von Braun, whether or not they wanted to admit it, was the man holding the torch. In August, CBS aired a special titled Race to the Moon, The Men Behind the Mission. It featured a 20-minute segment on von Braun, archival footage, smiling interviews. "A life devoted to science," the narrator intoned, not a single mention of 1943, or Dora, or the SS. The day after it aired, someone left a package at the front desk of CBS headquarters. No return address. Inside was a reel of film and a typewritten note. "Before the moon, there were tunnels. Show this too." The reel was blank. It had been erased. In a letter found years later, sent from von Braun to an old colleague in Munich, he wrote, "They want the rocket, not the past. As long as the tip points up, no one asks what fuels it." But not everyone had stopped asking. Oh. They announced it with fireworks. July 20th, 1969. A date burned into the world's memory. But in that moment when Neil Armstrong stepped onto lunar soil and transmitted those words, "That's one small step for man," the explosion of applause reached across continents. Yet somewhere beneath the thunder of celebration, a quieter explosion was fracturing the story America had carefully built. Within hours of the moon landing, Wernher von Braun was flooded with medals, invitations, and honorary degrees. Governors presented plaques, universities awarded doctorates, civic clubs named benevolent awards in his honor. He was the hero, a man who had once served a tyrant, now serving a democracy greater than any regime. Invitations poured in, dinners in Houston, galas in Washington, speeches at universities, letters of praise from presidents and generals. Everywhere, his past was a shadow that people forgot to mention. But not everyone had forgotten. In communities across the country and oceans away in Germany, survivors of Mittelbau Dora were writing letters to Congress. They recounted days of starvation, forced shifts, and the hollow echo of tools dropped in concentration camp tunnels. They dared to mention names, including his. Each envelope, hand-addressed, trembling, came with photos of loved ones lost, testimonies once given to Nuremberg. None was acknowledged. Many were never even opened. Behind closed doors, the ethical temperature in government nodded toward collapse. The CIA had quietly compiled a secret memorandum. Every accusation of war crime involving Project Paperclip scientists is to be tracked. No prosecution is to occur without top-level clearance. The memo circulated among agencies. It was signed, stamped, filed. No action followed. The archives show that most inquiries were dismissed months later as redundant, lacking evidence, or not in U.S. jurisdiction. Meanwhile, von Braun's inner life was unspooling. He began to sleep poorly. In private, colleagues overheard him muttering in German during night terrors, fragments of screams, underground tunnels, endless rock faces. He began carrying a Bible at all times, sometimes reading Psalms aloud in his study. He wrote cryptic lines in his journal. One entry read, "The stars do not judge, though I cannot escape their silence." Another, "I am building heaven on earth with tools forged in hell." It was not rational, perhaps not comforting, but it was confession. At church on Sunday mornings, he would sit alone in a pew, his posture stiff and prayerful. Some ministers asked if he wished to speak. He did not. The silence inside the sanctuary was portioned ration style. When critics suggested that von Braun's contributions were tainted by his past, NASA officials responded with coded defensiveness. Internal emails circulated under subject lines like Project Purity. Many read as arguments not about ideology, but sterling fuel efficiency. "Our achievements in propulsion cannot be overshadowed by resurgent controversy," one memo declared. "The enemy is not in our past, it is in the sky." But then came a leak. Late 1969, a former CIA archivist handed documents to an investigative journalist. Among them were redacted pages from the earlier memorandum. But the second section, a memo titled Retrospective File Review, was unredacted. It confirmed, for decades, the CIA had tracked allegations and intentionally blocked requests for trials. The dossier contained names, accusations, dates. Mina Lauer, Karsten Mueller, Johann Richter died in tunnel collapses. died of starvation, died following beatings by overseers paid under contracts held by the same agencies now recognizing von Braun. The journalist pushed the story. A high-ranking editor agreed, "We can't bury this." A headline was drafted, "Moon Dream Built on Broken Backs, Files Show." But just before print, the publisher called, "We're afraid it will derail Apollo's legacy," he said. Withdraw the story, no other major paper published it. Still, murmurs grew. A student protest at Stanford passed stickers that read, "Our moon was mined by prisoners." At Columbia, a panel discussion on ethics featured a Holocaust survivor who asked, "If we can reach space, why can't we reach justice?" The moderator walked off stage. The tape of the event was aired once on a small college radio station and then forgotten. In his home office, surrounded by models of Saturn rockets and lunar diagrams, von Braun's pale reflection stared back at him through the glass of a family photo, his wife and young son smiling under an open sky. He traced their faces, then turned back to his journal. What if progress demands silence? What if innovation kills our ability to remember? By 1972, as Apollo missions wound down and political headlines shifted, von Braun accepted the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He stood on a dais, shaking hands with the president. Family secretaries pressed flowers into his suit jacket pocket for good luck. Cameras thundered. No reporter asked about Dora. No senator whispered about prosecutions. But that night, he did something he had never done before. He invited 2 former Dora survivors to dinner. They hardly spoke. When asked what he wanted to say, he replied softly, "I wish I could erase what I read in your letters." And they stared at their plates, silent. They left before dessert. A year later, he suffered a mild heart attack. Months later, he retired. He moved quietly to Virginia, still subscribed to journals, still wrote letters to theologians. He volunteered at a veterans center. He spoke of forgiveness. He contemplated astronomy. He never wrote a public memoir that confronted his past. The sanitized versions remained in print. In the end, the moon mission succeeded. America triumphed above Earth's gravity, but von Braun's own gravity remained anchored in something heavier, ambiguity, because in reaching the moon, he had carried history with him, not erased, but buried, and buried things tend to echo. The cancer that killed him began in his pancreas, but seemed to have started somewhere deeper, in places medicine doesn't chart. It spread quickly, like secrets finally catching up. On June 16, 1977, Wernher von Braun died in Alexandria, Virginia. He was 65 years old. Newspapers around the world hailed him as the father of spaceflight, the architect of humankind's greatest leap into the stars. The Washington Post printed a front-page obituary under the headline, "Pioneer of the Space Age Dead at 65." Time magazine published a special tribute issue. The President of the United States released a statement, "Few individuals have so changed the course of human destiny." But as the wreaths arrived, as the funeral invitations were sent, and as old colleagues gathered to remember his triumphs, others were remembering something else. In a small flat in Munich, an elderly woman held a newspaper in her shaking hands. Her name was Ilse Danner. She had once worked under the mountain at Mittelbau, Dora, assembling the metal bones of V-2 rockets under threat of death. She had sewn wires with frozen fingers, seen friends collapse into the mud and never rise again, and had been forced to watch men hung for alleged sabotage. The face she now saw in the obituary, smiling, clean-shaven, surrounded by stars and stripes, was the same one she had glimpsed once, briefly, as he walked past their tunnel line with an SS officer. She remembered his voice, calm, precise. Her hands trembled violently as she placed the paper on the table. She did not cry. She had done that already, years ago. What she felt now was something more corrosive, erasure. The silence around von Braun's past had not broken. It had metastasized into myth. No official in NASA issued a statement addressing his ties to the Nazi regime. No reporter questioned the human cost of the rockets whose genius they praised. Television retrospectives mentioned only his dreams of Mars, his love of the stars, and his escape from tyranny to serve democracy. The Dora tunnels weren't part of that story. Neither were the thousands who had died inside them. But history, like radiation, leaks over time. In the early 1990s, as Cold War archives began to open and declassification efforts gained traction, researchers and journalists began combing through long-forgotten files. What they found was staggering. Operation Paperclip, long rumored and whispered about, had operated far beyond what the public had been led to believe. Not only had hundreds of Nazi scientists been brought into the U.S. through intelligence networks, many with direct ties to war crimes, but their files had been scrubbed, their affiliations falsified, and in many cases their records actively manipulated by American agencies. Among the most damning discoveries was a series of internal memos between the CIA, the Department of Defense, and early NASA leadership. One line read simply, "Do not ask what he did in 1944, ask what he can do in 1954. Another memo, dated April 1951, confirmed that allegations concerning von Braun's presence at Mittelbau Dora had been classified non-actionable due to national interest. A team of German journalists broke the story in 1994, publishing a full investigative piece titled Von Braun's Two Shadows. It ran in Der Spiegel, then made its way into the English press. But by then, the Cold War was over, and the world had moved on. The moon landing was sacred history. Few wanted to retell the tale with blood on the blueprint. Still, survivors did speak. One of them was Samuel Rice, a Polish Jew who had survived both Auschwitz and Dora. In a rare televised interview from 1995, he spoke quietly, almost too softly for the microphone to catch. "I remember him, not his face exactly, the way people moved around him, the silence when he entered, and I remember the rockets. They were built from our bones." When asked what he felt seeing von Braun honored in textbooks and museums, he said nothing. He only looked down at his hands, bent, scarred, and still stained with the past. Yet von Braun's legacy refused to die. As the 21st century dawned, a new generation of engineers looked to the stars again. Private companies were born in the image of the old NASA, only now faster, freer, and flush with private capital. SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, and as they rose, so did the story of Wernher von Braun, reborn again as the original dreamer. Elon Musk publicly praised him. Tech magazines ran features titled "The Man Who Taught Us to Dream Big." A bust of von Braun was erected at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville. Children posed next to it on field trips, unaware of what lay beneath its gaze. The deeper truth, the blood-forged foundations, the moral cost of his genius, had been anesthetized by achievement. Even among ethicists and scholars, a disturbing consensus emerged. History must bend to progress. The future, after all, had launches to prepare. But that consensus was not universal. In 2004, a Holocaust Education Foundation hosted a forum titled "Science, Silence, and the Price of Progress." One panelist, a historian from Tel Aviv University, delivered a haunting line. America didn't just inherit German science, it inherited its silence. In the front row, Ilse Danner, now in her 80s, nodded quietly. After the event, she asked if the quote would be printed in the program. When the organizer said yes, she said, "Then maybe something was not lost." In 2010, NASA quietly removed certain language from its website referring to von Braun as a hero of the American spirit. The wording was changed to key contributor to the space program. It was a small gesture, easily missed, but perhaps, for some, a signal that the silence had finally cracked. Von Braun's grave lies in Ivy Hill Cemetery in Alexandria. The inscription is simple: Wernher von Braun, 1912-1977. Below it is a reference to Psalm 19:1. "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Pilgrims still visit, engineers still leave flowers. But a few visitors come not to celebrate, but to remember differently. Some leave stones, a Jewish tradition of memory. Others leave photos of tunnels, of lost brothers, of rockets that never reached the sky. He once said that he felt closer to God when working on trajectories, that the stars made him feel small and odd. And perhaps that was true. But the trajectory of a life isn't calculated in velocity alone. It's measured in the weight it leaves behind. Von Braun changed the world, but the world he changed still struggles to reckon with how. He built a ladder to the moon using the hands of those who never got to see daylight again. And long after he died, those hands still reach up, not to accuse, but to remind us that history is not made only by victors or visionaries, but also by those who were silenced beneath the soil of progress. And now, the question isn't whether we remember von Braun. The question is whether we are ready to remember everything. Oh. He once said rockets were like dreams, mathematical, unforgiving, but beautiful. But dreams don't leave shadows. Rockets do. They scorch launch pads, rattle windows, and leave contrails that hang like scars across the sky. And long after they disappear, the ground remembers what lifted them. By the end, Wernher von Braun was no longer building anything. The cancer had stripped him of that. In the final days, as he faded beneath morphine and fading memory, no reporters asked what haunted him. No biographer sat beside his bed to ask if he'd ever dreamed of the tunnels, those cold, damp ribs of earth beneath the Harz Mountains, where men coughed blood into silence, while wiring futures they'd never live to see. No obituary pondered whether he slept peacefully or woke sweating, seeing eyes that never blinked again. They asked instead about the Saturn V, about the moon, about Mars, about the next step. But there's a question he was never asked and maybe never answered, even to himself. Did he regret it? Not the physics, not the science, not the altitude, but the trade, the transaction, the fact that a human life had been measured against propulsion and found less useful, that a camp was acceptable so long as a capsule reached escape velocity. Did he believe it was worth it? Or did he at some hour just before dawn, in some moment between breath and oblivion, feel it, that unbearable weight of what had been buried beneath genius? We cannot know. And maybe it doesn't matter, because history isn't what someone felt, it's what someone did, or allowed. What we do know is that the world kept turning, that children in classrooms still recite his name alongside Galileo and Goddard, that museums still display his blueprints under glass, while the blueprints of bones, of names and numbers inked on forearms, gather dust in archive boxes labeled sensitive. That rockets now bear logos instead of flags, that billionaires now sit where generals once did. That space is open for business, but not for memory. There is a photograph taken in 1945 of the Dora tunnels after liberation. Piles of emaciated corpses lie on the stone floor, their limbs contorted, their faces frozen mid-breath. The Allies took the photo as evidence, proof, a document against forgetting. And yet, somewhere in the same archives sits another image of the moon landing in 1969 with von Braun watching from mission control, hands clasped, face radiant. They are two pieces of the same puzzle, but we only hang one on the wall. In a declassified memo dated 1949, a Pentagon officer wrote, "It is better to win the war of minds than to lose the war of morals." The line was crossed out, then retyped, "It is better to be first." Beneath it, in handwriting, a final note. We can clean their records, we cannot clean their past. There are still survivors, fewer every year. Some choose not to speak, some cannot stop. One, whose name is rarely printed, once whispered in an oral history session, "I heard him once. He said the work was behind schedule. He didn't yell. That was the worst part. He sounded disappointed." When asked if she believed he remembered her, she said, "No, but I remember him." Memory is asymmetric like that. Pain lasts longer than progress. So now, here we are. A world spun from metal and myth, from rockets and rationalizations, from heaven built with hell's hardware. We livestream Mars probes while shuttering refugee camps. We fund AI that can write symphonies, while books on genocide go out of print. We name streets after pioneers and never ask who cleared the road. But maybe that's the real legacy. Not von Braun himself, but the equation he embodied. That genius plus opportunity minus accountability equals glory. That history doesn't ask if we did it. It asks if we looked away. And so now the question comes to us, not as spectators, not as students, but as inheritors. If you could go to the stars, but had to forget the screams, would you? Would you call it progress? Or would you hear behind every countdown the echoes of those who never got to look up? Let that be the silence we remember.